History is not a quiet, orderly place. It is a cacophony of voices, of triumphs and tragedies, a vast library where some books have their final chapters torn out. These are the stories that haunt us the most, not the ones with clear villains and heroes, but the ones that end with a question mark. They are the cold cases of centuries past, crimes that became mysteries and mysteries that hardened into legends. Long before DNA, before forensic science, before the digital footprint, justice was a fragile thing, often dependent on a sharp eye, a loose tongue, or simple luck. When those failed, all that was left was a void, a chilling silence where an answer should be. Today, we step back into that silence to examine three cases from the 19th and 20th centuries that remain so baffling, so profoundly strange, that they continue to defy explanation. Our journey begins not in the fog-laden streets of London, but in the chaotic, burgeoning metropolis of New York City in the year 1841. This was a city teeming with life and ambition, a place of gaslight and horse-drawn carriages, where new fortunes were made and lives were easily lost. And in this city, few faces were more recognizable than that of Mary Rogers. She was known as the beautiful cigar girl. Mary worked at a tobacco shop owned by John Anderson on Broadway, a location that made her a local celebrity. In an era when public interaction between men and women was highly formalized, the cigar shop was a rare space where men of all classes could gather. Mary's beauty, charm, and wit made Anderson's shop the most popular in the city. Men would come not just to buy tobacco, but to catch a glimpse of her, to exchange a few pleasant words. She was the subject of poems and articles in the penny press, a figure of public fascination. But this celebrity came with a dark side, an undercurrent of obsession and danger that Mary herself was keenly aware of. In 1838, 3 years before her death, Mary vanished for the first time. She left a note suggesting she had deep troubles and was contemplating suicide. The city's newspapers, already fixated on her, went into a frenzy. The story of the beautiful, missing girl was on everyone's lips. Days later, she returned. Her explanation was that she had been visiting a friend in Brooklyn. The press and the public largely accepted it, though whispers of a more scandalous reason, perhaps a secret lover or a clandestine medical procedure, never truly faded. For a time, life returned to a semblance of normalcy. Mary left the cigar shop and went to work for her mother, who ran a boarding house. She became engaged to a man named Daniel Payne, a cork cutter who lived in the house. On Sunday, July 25, 1841, Mary Rogers was reported missing for a second time. Her disappearance became a widely publicized mystery. She told her fiancé, Daniel, that she was going to visit her aunt, Mrs. Downing, uptown. She left the boarding house, dressed in a white gown, and walked out into the New York summer. She was never seen alive again. When she didn't return that evening, her family and fiancé grew worried. By the next day, panic began to set in. Daniel Payne placed advertisements in the newspapers begging for any information about her whereabouts. 3 days later, on July 28th, a group of men discovered her body. It was found floating in the Hudson River near a picturesque spot in Hoboken, New Jersey, known as Sybil's Cave. The discovery was horrific. Her body was badly bruised and waterlogged. Her clothes were torn and disheveled. A piece of lace was tied so tightly around her neck that it was embedded in her flesh. It was clear she had been murdered. An inquest was immediately convened. The coroner, a man named Richard Connolly, faced an immense task. The body was decomposing rapidly in the summer heat, and the science of post-mortem examination was in its infancy. Connolly's examination was cursory at best. He concluded that Mary had been the victim of a violent assault, likely by a gang of men, and had been thrown into the river. The cause of death was determined to be strangulation. But almost immediately, this official narrative began to fall apart under the weight of public scrutiny and media speculation. New York's penny press, fiercely competitive and utterly sensational, seized upon the story. Every paper had a theory. Every editor was a detective. The New York Herald, the Brother Jonathan, the Sun, they all published lurid, often contradictory accounts. They interviewed anyone and everyone, printing rumors as facts and speculation as evidence. The investigation became a public circus. One of the most prominent theories to emerge was that Mary had not been killed by a gang, but had died during a botched abortion. This theory was championed by several newspapers and was given weight by the testimony of Mrs. Frederica Loss, an innkeeper from Hoboken. Mrs. Laws claimed that on the Sunday Mary disappeared, a young woman matching Mary's description had arrived at her inn accompanied by a dark-complexioned man. She said the woman seemed ill and that the man had left only to return later in a panic before disappearing for good. Days later, Mrs. Loss's sons claimed to have found pieces of Mary's clothing, a parasol, a handkerchief, a petticoat, in a thicket not far from the inn. This discovery seemed to place Mary in Hoboken, near where her body was found. However, the story from Mrs. Loss was inconsistent and changed with each telling. Many believed she was either lying for attention or was somehow involved in trying to deflect suspicion. The abortion theory, while plausible to many, remained just that, a theory with no concrete proof. Another theory pointed to the gangs, or rowdies, that roamed the city's rougher districts. Mary's beauty attracted all kinds of attention, and it was suggested that she had been abducted and assaulted by a group of men she had rebuffed. This theory was supported by the state of her body and clothing, which suggested a violent struggle. The area in Hoboken where her clothes were allegedly found was known as a haunt for such gangs. Yet, no suspects were ever identified. The gang was a faceless, nameless entity, a convenient villain in a story with no clear antagonist. The case took another tragic turn a few months later. Mary's fiancé, Daniel Payne, who had been frantic with grief, was found dead near Sybil's Cave, the very spot where Mary's body was discovered. He had died by suicide, overdosing on laudanum. A note was found in his pocket, filled with remorse. It read, "To the world, here I am on the very spot. May God forgive me for my misspent life." His death immediately cast suspicion on him. Had he killed Mary in a jealous rage and then, consumed by guilt, taken his own life? It was a tidy solution and one the police briefly considered. But those who knew him insisted he was devastated by her loss, and his suicide was an act of despair, not guilt. Amid this storm of theories and tragedies, one of the most brilliant minds in America became captivated by the case. Edgar Allan Poe, who was living in Philadelphia at the time, saw in the Mary Rogers case a real-life version of the detective stories he was pioneering. He had already written The Murders in the Rue Morgue, introducing the world to his genius detective C. Auguste Dupin. Poe believed he could solve the Rogers case through pure ratiocination, the process of logical deduction. He transplanted the case to Paris, renamed the victim Marie Roget, and had his detective, Dupin, analyze the newspaper accounts to uncover the truth. In his story, The Mystery of Marie Roget, Poe, through Dupin, meticulously deconstructs the popular theories. He dismisses the gang theory as improbable. He casts doubt on the evidence found in the thicket. He ultimately concludes that Mary was the victim of a single killer, a naval officer with whom she was having a secret affair. Poe's theory was that the officer had accidentally killed her during a rough encounter or an abortion attempt, and then, in a panic, had disposed of her body in the river using a small boat. Poe claimed his solution was the correct one, and for years, many believed he had indeed solved the mystery. But Poe's solution, while brilliantly reasoned, was based entirely on the flawed and sensationalized newspaper reports of the day. He had no access to the actual evidence or police files. His story was a masterful piece of fiction, but it was not a factual resolution to the crime. So why does the murder of Mary Rogers remain unsolved? The reasons are a perfect storm of circumstance and the limitations of the era. Firstly, there was the complete absence of forensic science. In 1841, concepts like fingerprinting, blood analysis, or crime scene preservation did not exist. The investigation relied solely on eyewitness testimony and rudimentary autopsies. Mary's body was so decomposed that a definitive cause of death was difficult to establish. The scene where her body was found was immediately contaminated by the public, and the alleged crime scene in the thicket was discovered days later by civilians. Secondly, the investigation itself was chaotic and unprofessional by modern standards. The New York City police force was still in its infancy, a disorganized collection of constables and watchmen. There was no centralized detective bureau. Responsibility for the case was split between authorities in New York and New Jersey, leading to confusion and a lack of coordination. The police were overwhelmed by the public and press interference. This leads to the third and perhaps most significant factor, the role of the media. The penny press, in their hunger for a sensational story, effectively took over the investigation. They created a narrative and in some cases may have even created evidence. Witnesses were hounded, their stories twisted. Theories were presented as fact, poisoning the well of public opinion and making a clear-sighted investigation nearly impossible. The truth of what happened to Mary Rogers was lost in a sea of ink. Today, the case is a historical curiosity, a footnote in the career of Edgar Allan Poe. But it stands as a stark reminder of a time when a woman's life could be consumed by public fascination, and her death turned into a spectacle, with justice becoming the final victim. The trail of Mary Rogers' killer didn't just go cold, it was obliterated by the very city that had been so captivated by her. We now travel forward 70 years, from the crowded streets of the East Coast to the quiet, rolling plains of the American Midwest. Our destination is Villisca, Iowa, a small, unassuming town of about 2,000 people. In 1912, Villisca was the picture of rural tranquility, a place of church socials, close-knit families, and unlocked doors. It was a town that believed itself to be safe from the evils of the wider world. That belief was shattered on the morning of June 10, 1912. At the heart of the community were the Moore family. Josiah B. Moore, a successful and respected local businessman, his wife Sarah, and their 4 children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul. They were, by all accounts, a happy and prosperous family, deeply involved in their local Presbyterian church. On the evening of Sunday, June 9th, the family attended the Children's Day program at their church, an annual event organized by Sarah Moore. It was a joyful occasion, filled with songs and recitations by the town's children. After the program, 2 young friends of the Moore children, Lena and Ina Stillinger, aged 12 and 8, were invited to spend the night. The entire group, Josiah, Sarah, their 4 children, and the 2 Stillinger sisters, walked home together, arriving at their modest white house on East 2nd Street around 9:30 p.m. It was the last time any of them would be seen alive. The next morning, a neighbor, Mary Peckham, noticed that the Moore house was unusually quiet. The curtains were still drawn, and there was no sign of the usual morning activity. Concerned, she tried knocking on the door, but there was no answer. After trying to peer through a window and calling for the family with no response, she contacted Josiah's brother, Ross Moore. Ross arrived with a key, but it failed to open the door. He knocked and shouted. Finally, he pulled out his own set of keys and found one that fit the lock. He opened the door and stepped inside. The house was still and silent. He went into the downstairs parlor, but saw nothing amiss. He then opened the door to the downstairs bedroom. What he saw sent him reeling back out onto the porch, shouting for someone to call the sheriff. On the bed, he had seen 2 figures covered by a blood-soaked sheet. They were the bodies of the two visiting Stillinger girls, Lena and Ina. Town Marshal Hank Horton arrived soon after, and what he and the others who entered the house discovered was a scene of almost unimaginable horror. In the upstairs bedrooms, they found the rest of the victims. Josiah and Sarah Moore were in their bed. In the adjacent room were their 4 children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul. All 6 had been brutally murdered in their sleep. Every single person in the house, 8 people in total, had been bludgeoned to death. The weapon, an axe belonging to Josiah Moore, was found in the downstairs bedroom where the Stillinger girls lay. It was leaning against the wall, stained with blood. But it wasn't just the sheer brutality of the murders that shocked the investigators. It was the bizarre and ritualistic details of the crime scene. The killer had moved through the house with a chilling deliberation. Every victim's face had been covered with bedclothes after they were killed. It was as if the killer could not bear to look at what he had done, or perhaps did not want the victims to look back at him. Even more strangely, every mirror and piece of glass in the house, including the glass in the doors, had been covered with cloth or clothing. This detail was deeply unsettling and suggested a killer with a disturbed and specific state of mind. In the kitchen, investigators found a bowl of bloody water, as if the killer had attempted to wash his hands. Beside it, on the kitchen table, was a plate of uneaten food. A 2-pound slab of bacon was found leaning against the wall next to the axe downstairs. Its purpose or meaning has never been understood. The killer had also taken the time to lock all the doors from the inside and draw every curtain before leaving, ensuring the crime would not be discovered until well into the morning. He had entered and left the house like a phantom, leaving behind a scene of carnage and a host of baffling clues that seemed to point nowhere. The news of the murder spread through Villisca like a wildfire. The small town was plunged into a state of terror and disbelief. The crime scene, by modern standards, was immediately and irrevocably compromised. Before the sheriff could secure the house, dozens of townspeople traipsed through, touching things, looking around, driven by a morbid curiosity that destroyed any potential evidence. Souvenir hunters were said to have chipped off pieces of the blood-stained ceiling. The investigation was a product of its time. Law enforcement in rural Iowa in 1912 was not equipped to handle a crime of this magnitude. There was no fingerprinting. Blood analysis was primitive. The concept of crime scene integrity was barely understood. Bloodhounds were brought in, but they led investigators on a confusing trail that ultimately went cold at a nearby riverbank. The killer had vanished without a trace. Suspicion quickly fell on a number of individuals, turning the town against itself. The investigation became a whirlwind of rumors, accusations, and dead ends. One of the earliest and most prominent suspects was a man named Frank F. Jones. Jones was a powerful and wealthy Iowa state senator and a direct business rival of Josiah Moore. Moore had worked for Jones for years before leaving to start his own, highly successful farm implement company, taking a major account with him. Rumors swirled that Jones was furious and had hired a hitman to eliminate his competitor. This theory gained traction when a man named William Mansfield was implicated. Mansfield was a suspected serial killer from Illinois who was believed to be responsible for similar axe murders in other states. An investigation by a private detective agency hired by Jones's rivals concluded that Mansfield was the hired killer. A grand jury was convened, but ultimately not enough evidence could be found to indict either Mansfield or Jones. The theory remained a tantalizing but unproven conspiracy. Another major suspect was a traveling minister named Reverend George Kelly. Kelly was an odd, eccentric man with a history of mental health issues and inappropriate behavior. He had been in Villisca on the night of the murders, having attended the Children's Day program. He left town at dawn on June 10th, telling people he felt he needed to get away. His behavior was suspicious, and years later, he reportedly confessed to the murders to a fellow passenger on a train. Kelly was arrested and put on trial. The prosecution argued that he was a sexually repressed deviant who had snapped. They presented his confession, but his defense team argued it was coerced and that he was mentally unstable. Kelly's first trial ended in a hung jury. His second trial, in 1917, ended in a swift acquittal. The jury did not believe this strange little man was capable of such a monstrous act. After his acquittal, Kelly was largely forgotten by the investigation. Other suspects came and went. There was Andy Sawyer, a drifter who was briefly detained after he was overheard talking about the murders with an unnerving level of detail. He was eventually let go when his alibi, that he was in another town at the time, was confirmed by his employer. There was also a theory that a lone, transient serial killer was responsible, someone passing through town on the nearby railway line. This would explain the lack of a clear motive and the killer's ability to disappear so completely. This theory is supported by a string of similar axe murders that occurred in the Midwest around the same time, all involving a killer who entered a home at night, used the family's own axe, and then vanished. But no definitive link between the crimes was ever established. So why, over a century later, does the Villisca axe murder case remain cold? The reasons are a tragic combination of time, place, and human error. The single greatest obstacle was the contamination of the crime scene. Any potential evidence, fingerprints, footprints, fibers, was trampled and destroyed by dozens of curious onlookers within hours of the discovery. The investigation was doomed from the start. Secondly, the investigative techniques of the era were simply not up to the task. Without modern forensics, the police had to rely on eyewitnesses, confessions, and motive. In Villisca, there were no reliable eyewitnesses, the main confession was recanted, and the motives were all speculative. Finally, the intense pressure and small-town politics created an environment of paranoia and mistrust. The investigation was plagued by rivalries between different law enforcement agencies and private detectives. Accusations flew, reputations were ruined, but no solid case was ever built against anyone. The killer of the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters wasn't just a murderer. He slipped into a quiet house on a summer night, committed an act of unspeakable violence, and then dissolved back into the darkness, leaving behind only a blood-soaked house and a town forever haunted by the silence he created. The Moore House still stands on East 2nd Street in Villisca. It is now a museum, preserved as it was on that horrific morning in 1912. It serves as a grim monument to a crime that is not just unsolved, but perhaps unsolvable. For our final case, we move forward again to the twilight of the Second World War. The year is 1945, and the setting is Fayetteville, West Virginia. This story is different from the others. It is not a confirmed murder, but a disappearance so strange, so filled with unsettling coincidences and unanswered questions, that it has become one of the most enduring American mysteries of the 20th century. This is the story of the Sodder children. George and Jenny Sodder were Italian immigrants who had built a comfortable life for themselves in Fayetteville. George ran a successful trucking business, and the couple had a large, boisterous family of 10 children. They were well-known and generally well-liked, though George was known for his strong opinions, particularly his vocal criticism of Italy's fascist dictator Benito Mussolini. On Christmas Eve, 1945, the Sodder household was filled with festive energy. The older children, who were allowed to stay up late, were playing with new toys that their sister Marion had bought them. Jenny Sodder took the youngest children to bed and then went to sleep herself. The tranquil holiday scene, however, was about to be shattered. Around midnight, the phone rang. Jenny answered. An unfamiliar woman's voice on the other end asked for a name she didn't recognize. Jenny told the caller she had the wrong number and hung up. As she returned to bed, she noticed that the lights were still on and the front door was unlocked, which was unusual. She saw her daughter Marion asleep on the living room couch and assumed the other children who had stayed up were now in their attic bedroom. She turned off the lights, locked the door, and went back to sleep. An hour later, around 1 a.m., Jenny was woken again, this time by a loud thud on the roof, followed by a rolling noise. She dismissed it and went back to sleep. But a half hour after that, she woke for a third time, and this time she smelled smoke. She discovered that the room George used as his office was on fire, seemingly around the fuse box and telephone line. The house was burning. Panic erupted. George, Jenny, and 4 of their children who slept downstairs, Marion, Sylvia, John, and George Jr., managed to escape the rapidly spreading flames. They stood outside in the freezing night air, frantically calling for the 5 children who slept in the attic: 14-year-old Maurice, 12-year-old Martha, 9-year-old Louis, 8-year-old Jenny, and 5-year-old Betty. There was no response. The staircase to the attic was now a raging inferno. They were trapped. George Sauter, in a desperate attempt to rescue them, decided to use his work ladder to climb up to the attic window. He ran to the side of the house where he always kept the heavy ladder propped up. It was gone. Stunned, he came up with another plan. He would drive one of his large work trucks up to the house and climb on top of it to reach the window. He ran to his trucks. Neither of them would start. The engines, which had been working perfectly the day before, were dead. Meanwhile, Marion ran to a neighbor's house to call the fire department, but the phone was dead. Another neighbor tried to call from a nearby tavern, but the operator wouldn't answer. It was later discovered that the Sauter's phone line had been cut. By the time the fire department finally arrived, it was too late. The Sauter family home, a large 2-story timber frame house, had been reduced to a pile of smoldering ash in less than 45 minutes. George and Jenny Sauter stood helplessly in the snow, watching their home and, they believed, 5 of their children burn. The official explanation came quickly. The fire chief, F.J. Morris, suggested the fire was caused by faulty wiring. On December 25th, Christmas Day, the 5 missing children were declared dead. Death certificates were issued 5 days later. The assumption was that their bodies had been completely incinerated in the blaze. But for George and Jenny Sauter, this explanation made no sense. They began to question everything about that night, and the more they looked, the more they found that didn't add up. George, a practical man, couldn't understand how a fire, even a hot one, could have completely destroyed the children's remains. He had heard stories of animal bones surviving house fires. He questioned the fire chief, who told him the fire was hot enough to cremate the bodies. But a crematorium reaches temperatures far higher than a typical house fire. Jenny began conducting her own experiments, burning small animal bones in a stove to see if they would be destroyed. They never were. Her grief began to curdle into a deep, gnawing suspicion. Their suspicion was fueled by a series of strange events that had occurred in the months and moments leading up to the fire. A few months prior, a stranger had come to the Sauter home looking for work and had pointed to the back of the house, warning George that his fuse boxes were a fire hazard. George, who had just had the house rewired, thought this was odd. Another man, an insurance salesman, had tried to sell George a policy and became enraged when George refused, warning him that his house would go up in smoke and his children would be destroyed. Just before Christmas, the older Sauter boys had noticed a strange car parked along the main highway, its occupants watching the younger children as they came home from school. And then there was the missing ladder. It was eventually found thrown into a ditch 75 feet from the house. Why would someone move it? A telephone repairman confirmed that the phone line had not been burned through but had been deliberately cut. The loud thud on the roof that Jenny heard could have been an incendiary device, a theory supported by a bus driver who later said he saw people throwing balls of fire at the house that night. Convinced that their children had not died in the fire but had been kidnapped, the Sodders dedicated the rest of their lives to finding them. They hired a private investigator, a man named C.C. Tinsley. Tinsley uncovered a disturbing story. He was told that the fire chief, F.J. Morris, had found what he believed to be a human heart in the ashes. He had secretly buried it in a metal box, only telling this story years later. When the box was exhumed, the heart was sent to the Smithsonian Institution for analysis. The report came back, it was a beef liver, and it had never been exposed to fire. This discovery suggested a cover-up. Had the fire chief planted the liver to convince the Sodders that their children were dead and to stop them from asking questions? Over the years, a trickle of strange clues and potential sightings kept the Sodders' hope alive. A woman who ran a tourist stop claimed to have seen the children in a car that drove by while the house was burning. She said she served them breakfast at her stop the next morning. A woman at a hotel in Charleston, West Virginia, saw the children's photos and claimed to have seen 4 of the 5 about a week after the fire. She said they were with 2 men and 2 women, all of whom appeared to be of Italian extraction. In 1967, more than 20 years after the fire, Jenny Sodder received a letter in the mail. It was postmarked from Kentucky and had no return address. Inside was a photograph of a young man in his mid-20s. On the back of the photo was a cryptic, handwritten note. Lewis Sodder, I love brother Frankie. Ill boys, A90132 or 35. The family was stunned. The young man in the photo bore a striking resemblance to their son Lewis, who would have been in his 20s at the time. They hired another private detective to investigate the lead, but he took their money and was never heard from again. The Sodders incorporated the updated picture of Lewis into a billboard they had erected along Route 16, offering a reward for information. The billboard, with the faces of the 5 missing children, became a local landmark, a constant and public testament to a family's undying hope and unanswered questions. George Sodder passed away in 1969. Jenny continued to wear black in mourning for the rest of her life, tending to the memorial garden she had planted on the site of their former home. She passed away in 1989. The billboard finally came down after her death. The surviving Sodder children and their descendants continue to believe the 5 were kidnapped, possibly by someone connected to the mafia, as retaliation for George's outspoken criticism of Mussolini. So what happened to the Sodder children? Did they perish in a tragic, accidental fire, their remains obliterated by an unusually intense blaze? Or were they the victims of a sinister plot, kidnapped from their beds moments before an arsonist set fire to the house to cover the crime? The case remains officially unsolved. The initial investigation was deeply flawed, too quick to accept the accident theory and dismiss the family's concerns. The evidence, if there ever was any, was either destroyed in the fire or lost to the passage of time. The story is a labyrinth of strange coincidences, suspicious characters, and tantalizing but unprovable clues. It is a mystery born from a night of fire and smoke, a void in a family's history that could never be filled. Whether it was a tragic accident compounded by a series of bizarre coincidences, or a meticulously planned crime involving kidnapping and arson, the truth of what happened on Christmas Eve 1945 likely died with the generation that lived it. From the gaslit streets of 1840s New York, to the blood-soaked farmhouse in rural Iowa, to the smoldering ruins of a family home in West Virginia, these cases are separated by decades and vastly different circumstances. Yet they are bound by a common thread, a profound and unsettling silence. They are monuments to the limitations of their time, reminders that before the certainty of science, justice was a far more elusive concept. The investigations were hampered by contaminated crime scenes, a lack of technology, and the powerful sway of public opinion and fear. But more than that, they are enduring human tragedies. The murder of Mary Rogers was not just a puzzle for Edgar Allan Poe. It was the violent end of a young woman's life. The Villisca murders were not just a collection of eerie details. They were the annihilation of two families. And the disappearance of the Sodder children is not just a mystery. It is the story of a family's lifelong, agonizing search for answers that never came. These stories persist because they touch upon our deepest fears. The fear of random violence, of the unknown, of a world where terrible things can happen without reason or resolution. They remind us that history is not just a record of what we know, but also a haunting testament to all that we have lost and all that we may never understand. The trails have long gone cold. The witnesses are gone, and the evidence has turned to dust. All that remains is the echo of the question, a question that hangs in the air, unanswered, across the chasm of time. What really happened?